Well, welcome everybody to the first of the Rethinking Phosphorus Management webinars. We're about to begin. I would, before we get started, though, just like to first off introduce myself. I'm Pete Fondel, Associate Professor at Illinois Central College in East Peoria, Illinois. I think we need a couple thanks to the Illinois Soybean Association, the Soybean Checkoff, the Illinois Fertilizer and Chemical Association, and the Illinois CCA board for support of these webinars. And if you guys have any questions as the webinar is proceeding, you can type them into the message window, and we should be able to receive them, and we'll basically address all of the questions at the end of Dr. Laura's presentation. With that, I probably will introduce Dr. Laura Christianson. She's an assistant professor in water quality in the Department of Crop Sciences at the University of Illinois. She's done a lot of different research and extension work focused on environmental sustainability, cropping systems, economically thriving farms, clean water outcomes, and a lot of her background is in the area of agricultural engineering, working on such things as the design of biochip wood reactors, and removal of nitrates with those bioreactors, and also working with water quality in improving drainage ditch water quality in the state of Maryland. And she's done some research on drained dairy pastures, as well as she was also a Fulbright Fellow in New Zealand. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Laura Christianson to basically present the first topic on how we reduce phosphorus losses from fields.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Fondel. It's a pleasure for me to get to spend my lunch break with all of you. I hope your weather, wherever you are, is as beautiful as mine is today here in Urbana, Illinois. For the next hour or so, we'll be talking about how to reduce P loss from fields. Many of you know that phosphorus is essential for life on this planet, life as we know it. Phosphorus is actually the second most abundant mineral in the human body, second only to calcium. And calcium and phosphorus together are responsible for our strong bones and healthy teeth. But of course, phosphorus is much more important than just being in bones and teeth. It's also actually present in every single little strand of DNA in our bodies. So you see that double helix over on the right side of the slide. The little yellow dots in that double helix, well, those are phosphorus atoms. And so phosphorus is absolutely essential for us as human beings, but we also know that phosphorus is very important in terms of agriculture and the crops we grow. The figure on the right of the screen you see is just the basic phosphorus cycle, starting with inputs of phosphorus or phosphate to the soil. We have fertilizer over here. We have crop residue and manure return to the soil. What we really want to maximize, of course, is our uptake of phosphorus with our plants. And then the outputs of phosphorus from the soil in this phosphorus cycle are things like phosphorus removed in our grain harvest every year. And then what we're talking about today is the very right side of that diagram, runoff of phosphorus to water bodies. I want to start with a little bit of terminology of how we talk about phosphorus when we talk about water quality or when we talk about nutrient pollution due to phosphorus. A lot of times we talk about total phosphorus in water, total phosphorus in our lakes or our streams, but that really includes two general categories that are important to understand the difference. Starting with particulate phosphorus on the left of the screen there, sometimes I say particulate phosphorus, sometimes we say sediment-bound phosphorus or sediment phosphorus, and all those terms are interchangeable. But the idea with particulate phosphorus is that that's phosphorus that is associated with soil particles or organic pieces of organic matter. So just think of it as phosphorus that's being held by a particle of soil. So that's basically what it sounds like, sediment-bound phosphorus. Now, if you have erosion happening from your field, you know those sediment, the soil particles are being eroded off of your field, there's a good chance that you're at risk also for losing not just the soil, but for losing particulate phosphorus in that eroded material. The other part of total phosphorus is dissolved phosphorus. I like to think about dissolved phosphorus. It's similar to when you mix sugar in with your coffee, that sugar dissolves. So another example is when you could have a glass of very clear water that could actually be chock full of dissolved phosphorus, but it would just look like clear water. Well, that's because all the phosphorus is dissolved and it's too small for us to see. So together, the particulate phosphorus and dissolved phosphorus, that makes up total phosphorus. In terms of water quality, we know that in general, if you're looking for a general rule of thumb, most phosphorus leaving fields is sediment-bound phosphorus or particulate phosphorus. However, that doesn't mean that we can just ignore the dissolved phosphorus component, because dissolved P is very important because it's more biologically available than particulate phosphorus. When you think about water quality impacts, if you have dissolved P or dissolved phosphorus in your water, it's immediately available for algae to uptake that phosphorus and start to grow using that phosphorus. If you have particulate phosphorus, the phosphorus first needs to break away from the soil particle or the piece of organic material before it can be used by algae to grow. So that phosphorus might be a smaller component of the total load of phosphorus, but it's very important. I also want to talk about the two main ways that phosphorus can get into our surface water, surface runoff or surface erosion, and then also leaching to tile drain. So we have stuff happening on the surface of our soil, which is the surface runoff, and then stuff or a pathway happening below the soil surface or subsurface. Surface runoff is generally the bigger component of how we lose phosphorus from our fields. Obviously, if you don't have any tile drains, then leaching of phosphorus to your tile drains isn't going to be a concern for you. So generally, surface runoff, and historically in research, we've focused more on phosphorus moving from fields in surface runoff. What we're learning a lot with current research, however, is that leaching of phosphorus to tile drains in certain locations can be a much bigger loss pathway from our fields than we realized. For example, locations like Northwest Ohio, we know that leaching of peat to tile drains is an important loss pathway for those areas. Another complicating factor with the tile drain component is that if you have surface inlets or surface intakes on your tile drainage system, that can be a big potential pathway for losing particulate phosphorus in your tile drain system. Those surface inlets are really great at draining down ponded areas in our fields, but they can essentially serve as little superhighways from sediment on the surface of our soil. The surface inlets serve as a pathway for those soil sediments to get straight down into the tile drains. So here's a conceptualization of how phosphorus gets from our fields to a downstream water body like a lake or a reservoir, or, for example, the Gulf of Mexico. So starting at the right or the left of the picture, we have talked about soluble phosphorus or dissolved phosphorus. We've talked about particulate phosphorus. We've also talked about these arrows here, that's surface runoff. And then tile flow, which is that arrow there, subsurface flow. Now, an interesting thing happens between the field, our field, and this downstream water body. We have streams, which can carry phosphorus between our fields to these downstream water bodies. But what can happen in a stream is that the stream itself, the bank or the bed of the stream, can actually serve as either a source of phosphorus or a sink of phosphorus. If you think about that particulate phosphorus that we talked about, sometimes when stream banks or the bed of the stream is eroding, well, that's just like soil eroding from our field, and those sediments can have particulate phosphorus associated with them. So this is an area of very active research, actually, to quantify how much our streams themselves and the sediment in streams, how much are they contributing to the phosphorus that ends up downstream in our lakes or our reservoirs. And then at the right side of this picture, we have what would be, a lake or a reservoir. We have soluble P in the water, and then we also have particulate P coming into the reservoir. But what can happen with the particulate P is because that phosphorus is absorbed or being held by a soil particle, that phosphorus settles to the bottom of the lake or the reservoir over time. And at the bottom of the reservoir, we end up with this layer of settled particles that contains phosphorus. Under certain environmental or certain water chemistry conditions, that phosphorus that's being held at the bottom of the lake, that can desorb or be released by those sediments as soluble P. And so obviously there's a lot going on with phosphorus transport, starting from the field, ending up in lakes or rivers. So there's a lot to think about in terms of water quality. And this is a situation that we really want to avoid, these sorts of algae blooms in lakes or rivers. This is really pretty prime negative water quality impact that we want to avoid. We know that there are concentrations above which, total phosphorus concentrations above which, eutrophication or algae growth, and then dead zones or low oxygen zones because of that algae, we want to avoid total phosphorus concentrations above these levels here. For the Corn Belt region, which is where we are today, for lakes and reservoirs in the Corn Belt region, we really want to try to avoid total phosphorus concentrations above 0.038. And for streams and rivers, we want to avoid total phosphorus concentrations above 0.076. And when I look at those numbers, they look really small. I mean, 0.0 something is a pretty small number in my mind. And then when I think about the level of P or the P concentration in soil solution that plants need to grow, 0.2, 0.3, those numbers are pretty small too, but these water quality numbers up here are much smaller. They're an order of magnitude smaller. And to me, this is one of the whole challenges of phosphorus and water quality. The numbers that we think about for agriculture are much larger than the numbers that we think about for water quality. Very small amounts of P leaving fields can cause negative environmental impacts. That's the whole challenge in my mind, that these numbers that we're dealing with are so small. Now, another important point that I want to make is that a lot of times we talk about nutrient pollution or nutrients and water quality, but in fact, there's more nuance to it than that, because phosphorus and nitrogen are very different. From the agronomic side, you all are very familiar with this concept because plants need nitrogen and phosphorus for different reasons. They might need the nutrients at different times, and we supply them to meet different crop growth needs. So from the agronomic side, obviously nitrogen and phosphorus are different. But this holds true for water quality studies too. Nitrogen and phosphorus move differently from the field, and they move in different forms. For phosphorus, we've already talked about phosphorus can move through runoff, surface runoff, and drainage water. And phosphorus moves in both the dissolved phosphorus, like that sugar dissolved in water. Phosphorus moves in the dissolved form, and the particulate form. Now nitrogen, in our tile drain landscapes, like much of the Midwest, the primary concern for nitrogen is really only the dissolved form. You might hear people talk about nitrate in tile drainage. Well, nitrate is a dissolved form of nitrogen. And that's why tile drainage often looks just very clear, like that clear glass of water, but it can have nitrate in it. So nitrogen in this respect is a little bit simpler than phosphorus, because we're really just concerned about nitrate in tile drainage rather than these different forms that we have for P. Nitrogen and phosphorus are also different on the, due to the impact that they have on water. For phosphorus, freshwater bodies or algae growing in freshwater bodies is often limited by phosphorus. Algae growing in seawater or saltwater or marine waters is often limited by nitrogen. And so if you are concerned about local water qualities, local lakes and rivers, well, that's fresh water, and so often that algae growth in those is limited by phosphorus. This gets a little bit more complicated when we talk about things like the Chesapeake Bay or the Gulf of Mexico, because in the Gulf of Mexico, we have the Mississippi River coming in, which is obviously a freshwater body. And so in the Gulf of Mexico, we're concerned about both nitrogen and phosphorus pollution. because we have ocean water or salt water mixing with fresh water from the Mississippi River. So we talk about nitrogen and phosphorus in terms of water quality in the Gulf of Mexico. And lastly, nitrogen and phosphorus are different in how they can be removed from water, or how we can clean up water that has either nitrogen or phosphorus in it. Nitrogen, one of the main treatment mechanisms to take nitrogen out of water is the process of denitrification. If you're familiar with like a wood chip bioreactor or a wetland, denitrification is the process that happens in those little treatment systems. Denitrification is the conversion of nitrate in the soil or in tile drainage, conversion of that nitrate to nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. So basically these bacteria that live everywhere in the soil or in wood chip bioreactors or in wetlands, they convert the nitrate to a stable atmospheric gas, and so they can take this water pollutant and just convert it to a benign gas. The trick for phosphorus is that there's no similar process like that for phosphorus. Phosphorus doesn't have a gas phase. Like there's a nitrogen gas in the atmosphere all around us, well, there's no phosphorus gas. And so phosphorus treatment, once phosphorus is in water, it's difficult to get out, and we're often talking about a practice that settles particulate phosphorus out, so like a settling basin or some of the practices we'll talk about in the coming slides. Now I know not all of you are listening from Illinois today, but I want to give a hats off to the Illinois Soybean Association for hosting this webinar. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the state of Illinois. Illinois, we know, is an important contributor of phosphorus downstream. This is a map of total phosphorus headed to the Gulf of Mexico, and well, you really can't see Illinois on the map because it's covered in some of those darker red colors. The legend on this map says yield, but don't think about yield in this case in terms of like crop yield, which is how we normally talk about yield. What they mean by yield on this map is yield of phosphorus from our fields. The units on that map legend are metric units, which is what we use when we talk about science all the time, but I converted those units to English units or American units. So you see the red color, which is a lot of Illinois, unfortunately. That bright red color is 0.5 to 0.9 pounds of pea lost per acre per year, and then that maroon color is greater than 0.9 pounds of pea lost per acre per year. So in terms of agronomy or our phosphorus application rate, you know, less than 1 pound of pea per acre is very small compared to, it's a very small number compared to the rates that we think about applying phosphorus to our fields. So again, you see this disconnect of the numbers that we think about for phosphorus in terms of agronomics are different than the numbers that we know can cause a negative water quality impact. Looking more in-state, here's a map of watersheds across the state of Illinois, and you see some of those watersheds pop out as being a little bit darker red, having a little bit higher non-point source or agriculturally sourced phosphorus loss. In Illinois, we have over 2,000 miles of streams impaired by phosphorus, and unfortunately, over 100,000 acres of lakes impaired by phosphorus, and that's just in our state alone. A lot of times when we talk about water quality, we use the word impaired or impairment, and that just means that the water body is not able to meet its applicable use or its designated use. So if it's impaired, it can't meet that designated use. Examples of designated uses include aquatic life. And a designated use, if a stream has a designated use of aquatic life, well, that means we're concerned about those little critters and the fish that live in the stream. If it's impaired for aquatic life, that means those little guys can't live in that stream. Aesthetic quality is another applicable use that waters can be rated on. You know, if you're the guy with a $2 million lakefront property, you seriously don't want a lake to have an algae bloom in it because that lake has an important aesthetic quality. Public and food processing water supplies are very important. That's how we get drinking water, if you live in a city or have a municipal water supply. And then primary contact is one of the most important applicable or designated uses for our local water bodies. That basically means swimming or fishing. And some algae blooms that can be caused by phosphorus pollution, for example, like blue-green algae, that can be highly toxic. And so you can't go swimming if there's an algae bloom like that. That's a pretty serious impairment. So we now have a new reason to think about phosphorus leaving our fields and our runoff and our drainage water in Illinois. I hope some of you are familiar or have at least heard of the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy. Here is some numbers or a graph from our state-based Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy. And basically the story here is that we need to have our agricultural P-loss. The bar on the left is our baseline phosphorus load leaving the state of Illinois. So across all sources of phosphorus in our state, we send about 36 million pounds of phosphorus per year down the Mississippi River. Now, if you parse out just the contribution from agricultural sources, we know that our baseline load from ag across the whole state of Illinois is about 18 million pounds per year. And we want to divide that in half. The bar on the right shows our 45% reduction, so that's our goal. So we want to go from sending 18 million pounds per year from agriculture in the state down to about 9 million pounds per year. This is a table from our Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy, which shows different practices to help us achieve that reduction goal of taking our phosphorus load and dividing it by 2, essentially. And we're going to walk through these practices for the next couple slides to think about what practices might work for you. Starting with first practice, the scenario laid out is 1.8 million acres of conventional tillage eroding at greater than T converted to reduced mulch or no-till management. Okay, so what does that mean? First of all, what is this T value? That was part of the strategy. So what is a T value? Well, T means tolerable soil loss. And that's defined as the average annual erosion rate or soil loss rate that can occur and still permit a high level of crop productivity to be sustained pretty much indefinitely. So in other words, a T value is the amount of soil loss per acre that's kind of quote unquote okay. And they say quote unquote okay because you don't really want to be losing any soil from your fields. But this T value puts a number on it to say, well, if you're below this T value, then you're probably okay in terms of soil sustainability. T values range from 1 to 5 tons of soil per acre per year, depending on the soil characteristics and where you are. And again, a T value is target value or a goal. If you're interested in your T value, well, how do you figure out what it is for your own soils? And I suggest you go to the USDA NRCS Web Soil Survey. You can make a map like this map I created here for our South Farms. Here at the University of Illinois, you can find out all your soil types. And then by clicking different tabs on this Web Soil Survey, you can come up with a table like this, which tells you for each of your soil types that you have in your area of interest, what's your rating or what's your T value. And so you can see for all these silt loams or silty clay loams that we have on the South Farm, my T value was all 5. So 5 tons per acre per year. I want to be below that number. If you think back to the table that I just showed you from the Illinois strategy, T value was kind of the metric that we were looking at, but the way to get below that T value for your specific soil was reducing tillage. And tillage is defined, types of tillage are defined based on the amount of residue you have remaining in your field after planting. If you're talking about conventional tillage, that means you have less than 15% residue remaining after planting. So you're looking at something like that top figure on the right side of the screen. Reduced tillage practices leave between 15 and 30% residue after planting. So you're looking at something like that picture. That's the second picture down with about 20% residue remaining. And then conservation tillage is where we're really going. That's the recommended practice in our Illinois strategy. Conservation tillage practices leave at least 30%, so 30% or more residue in your field after planting. So you're looking at something like those bottom two pictures that I'm showing on the slide. There's several flavors of conservation tillage. No-till is kind of the golden standard that we highly recommend in terms of water quality. No-till is basically one-pass planting and fertilization, basically leaving residues minimally disturbed. And so that's kind of the gold standard. But again, there's strip till, ridge till, mulch till, so you can choose your flavor for the conservation tillage practice that works best for you. And based on our Illinois nutrient loss reduction strategy, reducing tillage to a conservation tillage practice reduces total P loss reduction by about 50%. Coming back to our table, here our next practice that we'll talk about is phosphorus application rate reduction on fields with soil test phosphorus levels above the recommended maintenance level. So as an infield practice, applying phosphorus at maintenance level really gets back to soil testing. And first of all, knowing what your soil test phosphorus levels are. Eventually, you want to get to a place with your soil test phosphorus levels where the phosphorus you're removing from your field every year in your grain harvest is exactly the amount of phosphorus that you put on that next year in terms of application. So that's what I mean by phosphorus maintenance level. And that, if you're operating under those conditions, you'll be achieving that optimum soil test phosphorus level over time. And I'm also showing on the bottom of the screen, I'm highlighting that this is part of the 4 R's code of practice. If you're really interested in what I'm talking about here, I highly, highly encourage you to tune in to the next 2 webinars where we have Dr. Tom Brulsema from the International Plant Nutrition Institute and also Dr. Antonio Mallarino from Iowa State University. I know for a fact that they will both be talking about this idea of P maintenance level and how to really manage our phosphorus application rates according to 4R nutrient stewardship. So speaking of International Plant Nutrition Institute, here is a map that they made. You'll note these numbers are a little bit old from 2010, and I believe they might have some new numbers out from 2015. But what this graph shows, what this map shows, is percent of soil samples testing below critical levels for phosphorus for major crops. Now look at Illinois. And what this shows is that 39% of soil samples in Illinois were testing below critical levels for P for major crops. Now if you flip this number on its head a little bit and do 100% minus that 39%, what that says to me is that, well, roughly 61% of soil samples were testing either right at that critical level or above. So in those samples, those might be places where we could think about maybe not applying as much phosphorus. There was very recently a study done by Dr. Fernandez here in Illinois where they took over 500 soil samples from across the state of Illinois, and they found that in that large number of soil samples, 59% of fields exceeded soil phosphorus levels recommended to achieve maximum crop yield. So those numbers seem to actually match up fairly well, that if you 100% minus the 39% from the map, and then that gives you 61%, and then that 59% from the study by Dr. Fernandez, thinking about phosphorus application rate will continue to be important. So if you want to think about phosphorus application rate, one of the best sources of information in Illinois is the Illinois Agronomy Handbook, and I took this information directly from that handbook. Phosphorus applications in Illinois really tend to depend on where you are in the state. So we have high, medium, and low areas of subsoil phosphorus supplying power. For example, if you're in a region of low phosphorus supplying power, you want to be looking at these numbers here. If your soil test phosphorus is less than 50 pounds of P per acre, you might think about applying P to build your soil test phosphorus. If you're in that low region and your soil test phosphorus is above 70, you might not need to make applying P a priority. Now, what happens if your soil test phosphorus is between these two numbers? Well, then you want to apply phosphorus at a maintenance level. And this, in my mind, if your soil test phosphorus is between those numbers, that's exactly where you want to be in terms of optimum soil test phosphorus. How to know your maintenance rate if your soil test phosphorus is between those two numbers? Well, it's just based on grain removal in crops, in the crop that you're growing. Again, this is from the Illinois Agronomy Handbook. So if we're following this applying P at maintenance levels according to the Illinois nutrient loss reduction strategy, that'll save us about 7% total P loss reduction per acre, working towards those water quality goals. And back to our table, the next practice we'll talk about is cover crops. Cover crops on tile drained acres, and then cover crops on acres that are eroding heavily. The idea with a cover crop is basically to protect the soil during the dormant season. If you think about the annual crops that we grow very well in Illinois, our corn and our soybeans, growing those annual crops leaves the soil uncovered for more than a few months out of the year. And so a cover crop essentially extends the period of the year where we have a plant or a cover crop actively taking up water, actively taking up nitrogen and phosphorus. Cover crops are typically planted in the fall, after harvest, sometimes before harvest, depending on how you're doing your seeding, and then cover crops are incorporated generally in the spring. When I talk about cover crops, I like to highlight the fact that I'm most interested in cover crops, grass cover crops that overwinter, because when you think about when we have a lot of drainage water leaving our fields, if you have a cover crop that overwinters, that does not winter kill, something that comes back in the spring is going to provide a lot of benefit for water quality improvement, specifically in the spring. Another consideration for cover crops is that robust establishment is the most important for having good water quality benefits. I realize the establishment piece gets harder and harder the further north you go, especially if you're working in northern Illinois. But I will say that I know folks in northern Iowa, northern Minnesota, they're all doing cover crops too. So as we know more about how to grow cover crops better with that short planting window for cover crops, cover crops hold one of our biggest potentials for water quality improvement. So based on the Illinois nutrient loss reduction strategy, we see about 30 to 50% total P loss reduction per acre. So again, cover crops hold great potential for improving water quality, and also depending on the cover crop that you grow, you could provide a lot of additional benefits. Now, no one cover crop is going to do every single thing, so you want to think about the cover crop that you choose. But again, lots of potential benefits. Back to our table from the Illinois strategy, the next practice is an edge of field practice, wetlands. And you'll notice something interesting here in the table. You see all those zeros. So wetlands turn out to be a great practice for reducing nitrogen pollution in water or reducing nitrate loads moving downstream, but not a very good practice for reducing phosphorus loads. We'll talk about why that is. I like to think about wetlands in terms of the full bathtub concept. Wetlands are great for N and many additional benefits, but for P, we really have the full bathtub concept. What do I mean by that? Well, if you imagine a bathtub that's empty, you turn the faucet on, the bathtub starts filling, eventually the bathtub fills up to the top. Eventually the bathtub is overflowing. And when you leave that faucet on, the water coming in is exactly the water going out because the bathtub is just full. How does this work in terms of a wetland? Well, imagine you have a brand new wetland that you put in. You have water start to come in. The water has phosphorus in it. Phosphorus starts to accumulate. That particulate phosphorus settles out to the bottom of the wetland. We also have nitrogen coming in the water. And what happens with the nitrogen is the process of denitrification. Remember we talked about that in one of the beginning slides just a couple minutes ago. This process of denitrification is where bacteria that live in our soil and also live in wetlands, they convert nitrate or dissolve nitrogen in the water to nitrogen gas. And so because nitrogen has that gas phase, wetlands turn out to be a really great treatment option for taking nitrogen or nitrate out of water before it gets downstream. So wetlands work great for nitrogen, but with phosphorus, over time, we just have the wetland build up and up and up and eventually become saturated with phosphorus. So again, it's the full bathtub concept where eventually, over long time frames, that wetland phosphorus coming in will essentially equal phosphorus going out. Moving ahead, another practice, edge of field practice, is a buffer. Buffers provide a lot of great benefits in our fields for water quality and for erosion and particulate phosphorus. Buffers slow runoff and allow that water to infiltrate. When the water running off of a field, like you see here, when that water is running off, it has a lot of energy and is moving quickly, has high velocity. And when it hits the stems of the vegetation in the buffer or hits that rougher area, the velocity drops of the water. So some of the energy in the water is transferred, which allows the velocity or the speed of the water to slow down. When the water slows down, that allows sediment and also particulate phosphorus to settle out of the water. So we're keeping we're not keeping the phosphorus in the field, but we're preventing it from moving any further downstream, keeping that phosphorus out of the stream. Limitations with buffers or some challenges is that sometimes land might need to be removed from production, which is a challenge if we're farming right up to the edges of our streams. And then buffers don't typically work at all, really, for tile drainage. If you have a tile, it's often going to go straight through the buffer and daylight right on that stream bank. Illinois strategy, buffers provide 25 to 50% total P-loss reduction per acre. The last practice in our Illinois strategy is this using perennials or energy crops as part of our rotation. So this is a land use change practice. This has to do with crop choice and sometimes referred to as an extended rotation. The idea of using a perennial or an energy crop is basically very similar to the idea of using a cover crop. You're just extending the period of the year that you have the plant actively growing, actively taking up water, you're keeping your soil covered for a longer period of the year. An extended rotation that uses a perennial might be something like corn, soybean plus at least 3 years of alfalfa, or maybe corn followed by 3 years of alfalfa. Alfalfa is, of course, a perennial, which means that it can grow for 2 or more years without having to replant it. Other examples of perennial vegetation include things like forages for haying or grazing or pasture, trees and woody species, energy crops like switchgrass or miscanthus or willow or poplar. This is a practice, of course, that not everyone will be interested in, and there are a number of limitations to doing an extended rotation or growing a perennial energy crop. First and foremost, really, markets. You know, if everyone is growing alfalfa, the price of alfalfa probably drops through the floor. You know, and so there's some economic issues there. Infrastructure and infrastructure challenges is also a limitation. If everyone is growing switchgrass, do we have the transportation networks? Do we have the processing networks to process all of that bioenergy crop. So obviously there's some limitations with this practice, but in terms of our strategy, 50 to 90% total P loss reduction. So that's a pretty high score there for perennials and extended rotations. And then just like cover crops, lots of additional benefits, environmental benefits. So we're going to switch gears for just a minute and talk more specifically about artificial drainage, which is near and dear to my heart. As many of you know, Illinois has a long history of artificial agricultural drainage because it improves crop growth and improves trafficability and really reduces risk in terms of our row crops. But we also know that tile drainage changes the natural hydrology. It changes how water moves through the soil and gets to streams. And in doing that, it serves as a pathway for nutrients to move from our fields. So we talked about that a little at the beginning, that tile drainage is a potential pathway for phosphorus to move from our fields. How nutrients move, how nitrogen and phosphorus move from our fields in our tile drainage networks depends on both controllable and uncontrollable factors. So this is something that I've been very interested in recently as part of my research program. And so to dig a little bit deeper into these controllable and uncontrollable factors, I recently did a study called a meta-analysis, which is basically where I read a bunch of drainage studies that have been done over the past 50 years from across North America. I actually read over 400 drainage studies that have been done over the past 50 years, and that allowed me to pull numbers out of each of the studies that I read and then make a database with these studies. One thing I want to highlight, these titles of papers, the example papers that I read, take a look at some of the titles and what the papers were focused on. So this first one, nitrogen application, tillage and split nitrogen fertilization. This is flow and nitrate loss, nitrogen. And then we have one paper down here for phosphorus transport. These are just example titles that I picked out, but keep that relative difference between the number of nitrogen and the number of phosphorus papers. Keep that in the back of your mind. Once I pulled out all the little numbers from these studies that I read, I made a nutrient load database called the Measured Annual Nutrient Load from Agricultural Environments, or MANAGE database. This is actually created and hosted by my collaborator, Dr. Harmel, who works for the USDA down in Texas. This database is free. It's publicly available. If you're interested in anything I'm talking about, you can go out to the website today and download this database. But basically what this database allowed me to do was make very general graphs like what I'm showing here. This graph is dissolved P load in drainage water. So think back to that. Total P contains both particulate P and dissolved P, so I'm showing just dissolved phosphorus here. And across the entire database, the representative load of dissolved P in drainage water was about 0.09 pounds of P per acre. So in terms of phosphorus application rate, this number is a very small number, right? Also, with this database that I made, I could pull out records that were only studies done in Illinois. And so the representative phosphorus load for Illinois was just a little bit higher than when I was looking across the whole database. But again, a very small number, 0.15 pounds of P lost in tile drainage per acre. Another way to think about this is the percent of P applied that occurs as drainage phosphorus loss. Looking at these numbers on the x-axis here, we're losing between 0 and 1% of our phosphorus application rate. So it's very small. In terms of agronomics, we lose a very small percentage of applied P rate through drainage. The challenge is that these are the situations that we end up with. This is the algae bloom that occurred in Lake Erie in the summer of 2014. Some of you may remember this because it caught a lot of press. This was a major event that caused the city of Toledo, Ohio, who you see right here. It caused them to essentially turn off their drinking water treatment plant to the citizens of Toledo, which was impacted about 300,000 folks. So not a good situation. Again, caught a lot of press. Well, if you know anything about Ohio, you know that northwestern Ohio has a lot of tile drainage. Okay, and so here's Toledo up here. Here's Lake Erie. So we know that, based on research that my colleagues have done in Ohio, we know that phosphorus does, in fact, move through tile drains. And we can say with a fair amount of confidence that this algae bloom in Lake Erie, the phosphorus in tile drainage did contribute to that. So where does drainage figure into our understanding of nutrient pollution? Remember at the beginning we talked about phosphorus can move in surface runoff and erosion happening over the surface, but also we know now in tile drainage. Here's an illustration of a historical perspective of how nitrogen and phosphorus move in our watersheds, and it's a pretty good illustration, but I want to ask you one question. What do you notice about tile drainage in this illustration? That's a little bit of a trick question because there is no tile drainage illustrated in this figure. And so historically, this just serves to illustrate the point that we've been much more concerned about losing phosphorus in surface runoff, like you see here, than we have been interested in quantifying how much phosphorus we're losing in tile drainage. Coming back to the managed database that we made, this graph, this figure, shows basically site years or pieces of information or records that I had when I compiled this database for dissolved nitrogen loads in drainage. So I had about 1,000 records of nitrogen loads in drainage water, which was about 4 times greater than any of the pieces of information that I had for dissolved P or total P. So clearly we've been studying nitrate loss in drainage water for a long time. We have a fairly good understanding of that, but we really need a better understanding of P loss in drainage. Now, while we need more research on phosphorus in drainage, we do know some things already, and so I want to wrap up with talking about this review article. If you're interested in phosphorus and drainage, this article is a great place to start. These are my colleagues, some of my colleagues from Ohio, really working at the forefront of this Lake Erie phosphorus and drainage issue. They made this great figure here. We know that phosphorus in drainage can be impacted by uncontrollable factors, or factors that we don't have any control over. The most important uncontrollable factor that impacts how much P we lose in drainage is tile flow. And that essentially means how much rain do we have. If it's a wet period, if we don't have plants growing, taking up the water in our fields, that period is a bigger risk for P loss in tile drains. Into controllable factors, these are things that we can make decisions about that impact how much P we lose in our tile drains. We know the 4 R's is important. That way that we manage P applications in our fields. There's a couple 4 R's, source, rate, timing, that are important to think about for minimizing P loss in drainage. Cropping system and tillage impact phosphorus and drainage, which you might not think tillage would, but it can impact how much P we lose in drainage water. And then the drainage system itself is something that we control. We make a decision about the drainage system, particularly these surface intakes or surface inlets like we talked about before. If you look at this illustration, here's an illustration of a surface intake, which is basically a conduit straight to the tile drain. So any P ponded up here, you get the idea. So I'll wrap up the slide portion of this webinar today with some parting points on phosphorus. Again, I want to highlight that very small amounts, small concentrations or small loads of P in runoff and drainage water cause water quality problems. And this is really the challenge of phosphorus and water quality is that I'm talking about numbers that are much smaller than we talk about when we talk about phosphorus application rates. I also want to highlight that phosphorus is different from nitrogen. You understand this from the crop growth side, but when we talk about nutrient pollution or nutrients and water quality, phosphorus and nitrogen are very different, and we have to think about them differently. We have lots of good practices to reduce the amount of P that we're losing downstream to the Gulf of Mexico or to our local lakes and rivers, but it is a complex problem. Not all practices will be equally suitable or effective and at every location, and no one farmer would be interested. You know, one farmer is going to be interested in different things than another grower. Best option is to keep P in your field. Be managing phosphorus right, keep it there, because once that phosphorus is in the water, it's difficult to get out. So with that was all I had in terms of slides, and I'd be glad to take any questions.
Well, Laura, I've got 4 questions here right off the bat that I can run by you and you can maybe address. The first one being, I had a turkey producer. Obviously, they use up to 7 to 10 tons per acre of turkey manure on their fields. Their phosphorus levels are already very high, but they still need to get rid of the manure, and they want some ideas on maybe what they should do, or what would be your advice in that situation?
Oh, that is very tricky. Yep, and incorporating, you know, animal agriculture and manure. I certainly understand that you have a disposal issue. You have limited storage, and doing something with that manure is important. Really, the only thing that I could say for water quality would be you might be looking at transporting that manure farther and farther away, just so that you're not continually building up STP, soil test phosphorus levels, year after year after year on the same soils. If you're applying year after year on the same soils, and so that's not a great answer. That's not a great solution. But thinking about transporting that manure to new fields, to other areas, that's not a great answer again, but it is a answer.
And the next question, how do you think no-till impacts phosphorus losses compared to a tillage program when you're surface applying your phosphorus?
That's a good question. And I don't want to pass the buck so much, but that would also be a good question for the upcoming webinar. So I encourage you to tune in and to think about asking that question to Dr. Brolsma or Dr. Mallarino. I can say that in terms of drainage, no-till can actually create little pathways that go, little pathways or channels or cracks, that naturally form in the soil when we're doing no-till. If the system is drained, those cracks can extend all the way down to the drainage pipe. And so in certain cases, no-till might increase some drainage phosphorus loss. Now, I'm not saying don't do no-till. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I am just making the point that we do have some trade-offs between practices.
Next question. What are your thoughts on the polymer technology that attracts cations to the soil and would allow possibly more of that phosphorus to be applied and be available to plants?
I am not familiar. I'm not familiar with that technology. It sounds interesting. As a researcher, I would say we definitely would want to have some good research done on anything that we're applying to our soils. But yeah, I'm not familiar with that technology. Sounds interesting, though.
Okay, and the last question here on the sheet I have in front of me right now. Can you address and there's basically 4 parts to this question. Can you address phosphorus loss on claypan soil south of Route 16 in Illinois as compared to maybe the rest of the state? Is what's the first part?
That's a good question, and I should have, sake of full disclosure here, I've been in my current position at University of Illinois for less than 6 months, and so I'm not going to have a very good answer here. I'm still learning geography in the state. I'm still learning all of my roads, and I'm still learning where all my different soil types are. And so I don't have a great answer for that question. Was there a second part to the question?
Yeah, the second part would be, what do you think about phosphorus losses in a wheat double crop soybean system compared to, I guess, probably just a conventional corn soybean rotation?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. In terms of phosphorus management, that Illinois Agronomy Handbook has different maintenance replacement levels for all the different crops, and wheat was obviously listed in that table. If you're doing, I can say that there is some interest in winter wheat being used as a cover crop, and so I think that does provide some water quality benefit. Anything you can do to keep your soil covered for longer periods of the year than you would with just a conventional corn and soybean, that's the way to go, keeping the soil covered for longer portions of the year.
And then the third part, what do you think about injecting your phosphorus versus surface applying?
So in terms of surface runoff, I believe the way to go, or the strategy, is to incorporate your phosphorus so that it's not just sitting there right on the surface so it can run off. I think sometimes if we're talking about drainage, it can get tricky. Depending on the source of phosphorus that you're injecting, there have been a few studies where, for example, liquid swine manure has been injected, and it ends up showing up in drainage fairly quickly, just for a short period of time. And so I think that's something to be concerned about. But generally, incorporating your phosphorus so that it's not sitting on the surface is generally a better thing. But I encourage you, again, to tune into the next webinars, especially Dr. Brolsman next week, because I know he's really a good source of information on the 4Rs.
Okay, and then there were just a couple questions just came in. One was the t-value that's been established for the soils for erosion control is probably doing okay as far as erosion or soil loss, but what, in your opinion, is it good enough for protecting water quality?
So question about t-value and water quality. Like I said on my slide, the concept of a t-value is kind of a goal where you want to be below the t-value. But, in my mind, in terms of sediment and erosion and water quality on that front, really you don't want any erosion from your soil. You don't want anything eroding. That's going to be hard to do depending on the kind of storms that we have rolling through. But I think both from the ag management side and from the water quality side, the more we can keep our soil 100% in our field, that's the strategy. But t-value is a simple concept to understand and convey, and so it does set a good kind of generic rule of thumb goal.
And then there was another one. What is the contribution of municipal sewage in the management of phosphorus?
Municipal sewage, I don't know if that question is asking more about like field application of wastewater biosolids from municipal plants. I don't think that's what the question was asking, but if you look back at that slide I had from the Illinois strategy, does break out contributions of phosphorus by source. And so there was the ag component, which was about 18 million pounds of P per year that we were sending down the river. But the total load from the whole state of Illinois was about 36 million pounds. And so a very small percentage of that was from urban runoff. And that was the top part of the bar, and that was a very small percentage. But you could say, the P load coming from the state of Illinois is roughly half and half, ag and point sources. So those point sources include things like factories or food processing plants, but also wastewater treatment plants.
Okay,
Roughly half and half. Yep.
Okay, two more questions just came in. And one is, do higher soil test levels of phosphorus increase the chances of loss from dissolved phosphorus?
Yes.
And then the other one that goes along with that is, do applications of phosphorus on the surface, especially on frozen soils, increase losses as well?
The frozen soil issue is a tricky one, and I think the kind of recommended standard practice is to not be applying manure, especially on frozen soil. I think that's, for me, it's kind of a no-brainer. I don't think we should be applying on frozen soils. Again, that's my perspective as a water quality professional. Yeah, so I would avoid that if possible.
And I guess my perspective, I would tend to agree with you. Being one of the regional cover crop specialists from Illinois, I get to study cover crops a lot, and from a lot of these questions we're getting, a lot of the species of cover crops would address a lot of these questions of, surface application or erosion or any of those issues could help. Cover crops can drastically change that phosphorus losses, both dissolved and erosion, just simply adding that practice to the operations around the state.
Amen. You're preaching to the choir.
Well, I guess if there's no more questions, which I don't see any more coming through, I'd like to thank everybody for being on. Again, thank the Soybean Association, Soybean Checkoff, Fertilizer and Chemical Association, and the Illinois CCA Board for their support in these webinars. And remind any of the people that are on, there are 2 more webinars coming up the next 2 Tuesdays, on the 22nd with Tom Brusselma, and on the 29th with Antonio Mallarino. And those you need to register for those individually if you want to sign on for either one of those webinars that are upcoming here in the very near future. With that, thank all of you for being on, and we'll be signing off till next week and hope to see you back then.